The guard who saved the king's life was executed by the chief's wife. They executed the man who saved the king's life, not the assassin, not the plotter. The guard who threw his own body between a blade and his king, they killed him 7 days later, in the same courtyard where the whole kingdom had once cheered his name. And the woman who signed the order was the same woman who had planned the assassination in the first place. If you think you know how this story ends, you don't. Stay with me till the last minute because the twist in the middle of this one will make you go back and re-watch the beginning. And if you are the kind of person who likes a story that doesn't hold your hand, hit subscribe now because this channel exists for people exactly like you. My name does not matter in this story. What matters is what I saw, because I was the boy who carried water into the guards' quarters of Ilodun, and I saw everything that happened to Adisa Bankole, the finest guard the kingdom of Ilodun ever raised, and the way his own kindness became the rope that hanged him. Ilodun was not a small town. It sat between 2 rivers guarded by 7 hills and ruled for 11 years by Oba King Ogundipe, a king who had come to the throne young, hungry and suspicious of everyone except the one man his father had trained personally to guard his back, Adisa. They had grown up together, the king and the guard, one born into velvet, the other born into calloused hands, and somehow that difference had never once come between them. Adisa did not simply protect the king, he loved him the way a brother loves a brother he has buried disagreements with. That kind of loyalty in a palace is either the safest thing in the world or the most dangerous. Ilodun would soon learn which one. The king had a wife, Aduke, gentle and watchful, and a young daughter, Simisola, who liked to hide behind Adisa's legs whenever the thunder drums sounded too loud during festivals. Adisa had his own family too, a wife named Bisi, who sold woven cloth in the market, and a 9-year-old son named Femi who wanted to grow up and be exactly like his father, broad-shouldered, quiet, and impossible to fool. Adisa had come to the palace at 14, the son of a blacksmith who died young from a wound that never healed properly, leaving his mother to raise 3 children on the little the forge still earned. The old king, Ogundipe's father, had noticed the boy first, not for his strength, though he had plenty of it even then, but for the way he stood at the edge of every crowd, watching entrances and exits the way other boys watched wrestling matches. That one sees rooms the way a hawk sees a field, the old king had once told his son, and he was right. By 18, Adisa was training under the palace guard captain. By 25, he was the captain. By 30, when the old king died and young Ogundipe took the throne amid a council still uncertain whether he was ready to rule, it was Adisa who stood closest to him through every early crisis, every whispered doubt about his fitness to lead, every hungry rival chief testing the boundaries of a new king's patience. They had built 11 years of trust, the slow way, the only way trust is really built, through nights neither of them spoke about afterward, decisions made in rooms with no witnesses, small kindnesses that cost Adisa sleep and cost the king nothing but never once went unnoticed. Bisi used to tease her husband that he loved the king the way some men love an older brother they never had, fierce and uncomplicated, and Adisa never denied it. He trusted me before he had reason to, Adisa told her once, lying beside her in the dark, Femi's small breathing audible through the thin wall between their rooms. A man remembers who trusted him first. It is important you understand this bond, this history, this weight of 11 quiet years, because everything that happens later in this story only makes sense once you understand exactly how much Adisa had already given this king and exactly how much he still had left to give before it was taken from him by people who had given the throne nothing at all except patience and performance. But there was another figure in this palace, one whose name you need to remember because she is the reason everything I'm about to tell you happened. Her name was Yewande, and she was the wife of Chief Balogun Adeosi, the second most powerful man in Ilodun after the king himself. Yewande smiled more than anyone in that palace. She complimented the queen's fabric, she blessed the little princess's forehead, she sent yams to the guards' quarters during festivals. Everyone loved Yewande, except Adisa, who had a strange discomfort around her that he could never explain, the kind of discomfort a hunter feels in a forest that is too quiet. He never told anyone about that feeling, not even his wife, because what do you say? I don't trust her, but I don't know why. In a palace built on alliances, a feeling is not evidence, and feelings, as Adisa would learn too late, don't save lives. Only proof does. And by the time he had proof, it was already being used against him. This is where the story truly begins, 3 months before the Harmattan Festival, the biggest gathering in Ilodun's calendar, when every chief, every trading family, every neighboring kingdom's envoy would come to pay respect to Oba Ogundipe under one roof. Chief Adewasi had grown restless in his old age. He was 61, his hands trembled during council meetings, and everyone in the palace whispered that his time as Balogun, the war chief, was ending. The king had begun to favor a younger commander for the next war council appointment, a decision that Adewasi had accepted publicly with grace and privately with fury. But it was not Adewasi who could not accept it. It was his wife. Yewande had married Adewasi when she was 17 and he was 40. She had spent 24 years building a version of herself that the palace adored, smiling at gatherings, whispering comfort to grieving widows, memorizing which chief liked his palm wine sweet and which liked it bitter. But under every smile she gave, she was counting favors, counting debts, counting who owed her silence and who owed her loyalty. Because Yewande had never planned to be simply a chief's wife. She had grown up watching her own mother discarded by a husband once his eyes wandered to a younger woman, and she swore standing over her grave at 19 that no man would ever again decide what became of her future. If her husband's power was sleeping, then she would build her own, quietly, invisibly, until the day came when she no longer needed his name to protect her. That day, she decided, would be the day Oba Adekunle Ogundipe stopped breathing. You have to understand what 24 years of smiling on command does to a person. Yewande had learnt long before she ever married Adewasi that a woman's visible anger gets punished, while a woman's invisible calculation gets ignored. So she had simply stopped being visible in any way that mattered. She learnt the names of every chief's children. She learnt which market women owed debts and quietly forgave a few of those debts herself in small anonymous gestures that built her a network of gratitude she never once had to explain. She learnt, most usefully of all, which servants in which households could be reached through money, through fear, through old family debt stretching back generations, and which could not. Rotimi's family had once, 3 generations back, been indentured to Yewande's own mother's household before that household collapsed into poverty, and though the debt itself had long since been forgiven by law, Yewande made certain Rotimi never forgot that his grandmother's freedom had technically come as a gift from her family, a gift that could, she reminded him gently over the years, always be reconsidered in spirit if not in law. It was not blackmail exactly, it was something quieter and crueler, a debt of obligation stretched so thin across generations that Rotimi himself could not have told you if asked plainly why he felt he owed her anything at all. Only that he did, the way a man feels the weight of a stone in his shoe long after he has forgotten exactly when it got there.
This was how Yewande built her plot. Not with soldiers, not with open declarations, but with dozens of small, invisible threads pulled taut over years, so that when the moment finally came to act, she needed only to tug gently and watch the whole web move for her. I want you to notice something here, because this is where most people misjudge this story. Yewande did not want the throne stripped from the king's bloodline out of hatred for the king personally. She wanted it because the king's younger half-brother, Prince Kayode, banished from court 8 years earlier, after a scandal involving stolen tribute gold, had returned to Ilodun in secret, and he had made her a promise. If Oba Ogundipe died without an heir old enough to rule, the council would need a regent. And Kayode had sworn, in a moonless meeting behind the old shrine at the edge of the seventh hill, that if Yewande helped him take the regency, he would marry her the day her husband was, in his words, no longer a concern. Yewande had looked into Kayode's eyes that night and believed him completely. Because ambition recognizes ambition the way a wolf recognizes another wolf in the dark, even in a stranger's coat. Now, remember the Harmattan Festival I mentioned? That was the date they chose. Too many people, too much movement, too many strangers in the crowd for any single face to be memorable. A perfect night to kill a king and disappear into the noise of celebration. Before we go further, let me pause here, because I promised you this story does not do easy twists, and I meant it. Subscribe now if you want to see exactly how a loyal man's greatest virtue becomes the very thing used to destroy him, because what happens next will make you question everyone in this story, including people you have already decided to trust. 3 weeks before the festival, Adisa noticed something small. A servant named Rotimi, who worked in the chief's household, began appearing near the king's private stables at odd hours, always with a reasonable excuse: delivering feed, checking harnesses, running errands for Madame Yewande. Adisa said nothing at first. He simply watched. That was who he was, a man who watched twice before he spoke once. On the 12th day, Rotimi was caught by one of the junior guards slipping something small and wrapped in cloth into the saddlebag of the horse the king rode during ceremonial processions. When questioned, Rotimi claimed it was a charm from Madame Yewande, a blessing for the king's safety during the festival season, nothing more. The junior guard, not wanting to offend the Balogun's household, let it go and mentioned it to Adisa in passing, almost as a joke. Adisa did not laugh. That night, he unwrapped the cloth bundle himself in the privacy of the guards' quarters. Inside was a small clay figure, a crude representation of a man with 3 iron needles pushed through his chest, and beneath the figure, a folded scrap of parchment with symbols Adisa did not recognize. He was not a superstitious man, but he understood enough of Ilodun's older traditions to know that this was not a blessing. This was a curse object, meant to be planted somewhere close to its target so that its malevolence would seep into daily proximity. Whether or not Adisa believed in its spiritual power, he understood its practical danger immediately. Someone inside the palace wanted the king dead, and they were using the trusted movements of a chief's household to get close enough to try. He told no one but the king himself, in private, after the evening council had emptied. Oba Ogundipe listened, turned the clay figure over in his hands, and said the words that would haunt Adisa for the rest of his life. Watch, do not accuse. A chief's wife is not a market thief you drag before the elders on a servant's word. Bring me proof, Adisa, real proof, and I will act. Until then, you are my shadow. Stay close. And if I find proof and it points to her? Adisa asked. The king was quiet for a long moment, staring at the small clay figure in his palm as though it might answer for him. He finally said, I will do what a king must do, no matter whose wife she is. He believed himself when he said it. Adisa believed him too. Neither of them yet understood how differently that promise would look once it had to survive a council chamber full of frightened, self-interested men, instead of the quiet privacy of a candle-lit room. Adisa obeyed. That obedience, that patience, is what killed him. In the days that followed, Adisa began his own quiet investigation, the kind a careful man conducts without ever letting their target know they are being watched. He walked the route Rotimi had taken to the stables 3 separate times at 3 different hours, memorizing which guards were posted where, which doors went unwatched during the changing of shifts. He spoke casually to the stable hands about which households sent gifts most frequently for the king's horses, learning that Yewande's gifts, though frequent and always generous, arrived with unusual specificity about exactly where in the stable they should be placed. Always near the saddle the king used for ceremonial rides, never near the others. He noted, too, that Yewande had begun, in the weeks leading up to the festival, spending considerably more time in private conversation with traders from the northern delegation, men whose caravan happened to be passing through Ilorin that season, men whose goods included, among the usual salt and cloth and dried fish, finely crafted ceremonial weapons of exactly the kind that could disappear into a festival crowd without drawing a second glance. For a time, Adisa's suspicion did not even settle on Yewande at all. His first instinct, shaped by years of border skirmishes and old rivalries, landed on the northern trading delegation itself, whose caravan leader, a sharp-eyed man named Danladi, had once been turned away from Ilodun's market years earlier over a dispute involving underweighted goods, a grievance that could, Adisa reasoned, have festered into something darker. He spent nearly a week quietly investigating Danladi's movements instead, tracing which compounds the caravan traded with, which chiefs received private visits beyond the usual market stalls, and it was only when he realized that Danladi's caravan had arrived in Ilorin a full 2 weeks after Rotimi's first suspicious appearance near the royal stables that the timeline finally broke apart in his hands and forced him to look elsewhere. Whoever planted the clay figure had access to the palace long before any northern trader ever crossed Ilorin's gates. It's worth pausing on this because it tells you something important about how carefully Yewande had built her plot. She had not needed Danladi's caravan to arrive early. She had simply needed a household established, trusted enough, ordinary enough that no one would think to question its comings and goings until it was far too late to matter. Adisa's week chasing the wrong trail cost him time he did not know he was losing, time Yewande used to tighten every remaining loose thread in her plot, and by the time his suspicion finally, correctly, settled on the one household in the entire palace with the deepest, oldest access to every quiet corner of Ilodun's daily life, the festival was less than 10 days away. None of it alone was proof of anything. A gift placed near a particular saddle, a conversation with traders, a servant's nervous excuse. Adisa knew this better than anyone. He had spent his whole career learning that suspicion without proof was worth less than nothing in a palace, because a false accusation against the wrong person could end a guard's career faster than any battle.
Blade. So he did what he had always done best. He waited and he watched, and he said nothing, gathering pieces he did not yet know how to arrange into a whole picture, while 3 streets away, in the chief's private quarters, Yewande finalized the last details of a plan that had already survived months of careful construction. For the next 2 weeks, Adisa moved through the palace like a second heartbeat behind the king. He inspected every gift that arrived for the festival, every basket of kola nuts, every roll of fabric sent by visiting chiefs. He personally tasted the king's wine before ceremonies, a duty usually left to a lesser servant. He slept 2 hours a night. His wife Bisi began to notice the hollows forming under his eyes and asked him gently what was eating him from the inside. He could not tell her. He simply held her hand and said, "Something is coming, and I need to be the wall it breaks against, not the gate it walks through." Now, here is where the story turns, and I need you to pay close attention, because this is the piece almost everyone gets wrong when they hear this tale secondhand. On the night of the Harmattan Festival, the courtyard of Ilodun's palace overflowed with drummers, dancers, visiting royalty, and firelight. Oba Ogundipe sat upon a raised platform beside his queen, his daughter Simisola dancing barefoot in front of him with the other palace children, and Adisa stood 2 steps behind the throne, as he always did,
scanning faces the way other men scan the horizon for rain. The smell of roasted yam and palm oil drifted through the courtyard, mixing with the smoke of a dozen small fires lit along the perimeter for warmth against the Harmattan chill. Visiting chiefs sat in rows of carved stools, their attendants standing behind them with fans and fly whisks. And beyond the firelight, ordinary families from every corner of Ilodu pressed close to watch their king enjoy the one night of the year built entirely for celebration. Adisa had positioned 4 extra guards along the outer edges of the crowd that night, more than tradition called for. A decision the council had quietly questioned as excessive only days earlier. He had not explained his reasoning to anyone but the king. He simply stood his post, eyes moving in the slow practice sweep he had used every festival night for 11 years, and told himself that a feeling was not proof, but a feeling was still worth watching. At the height of the celebration, when the drummers reached their loudest crescendo and half the courtyard had risen to dance, a man Adisa did not recognize pushed through the outer ring of dancers towards the platform. He wore the plain wrapper of a common festival guest, nothing to distinguish him, which was exactly the point. Adisa's eyes caught the wrongness before his mind could name it. The man's hands were empty, but his stride was too straight, too purposeful, cutting against the current of dancers instead of moving with them. Adisa moved. He crossed the platform in 3 strides and reached the man just as a short blade, hidden in the folds of the wrapper, came free and arced towards the space where the king had been sitting a heartbeat earlier, because Adisa, without a word, had already pulled Oba Ogundipe backward off the platform by the shoulder of his robe. The blade, missing the king, caught Adisa instead, opening a long gash across his forearm as he wrestled the assailant to the ground. Guards swarmed. The would-be assassin was overpowered within seconds, dragged away, screaming something in a dialect none of the palace guards recognized. And the festival dissolved into chaos, drums stuttering into silence, dancers scattering, the queen shielding Simisola's eyes from the blood on the stone. The king was safe. Adisa was bleeding but alive, and for one single night, Adisa Bankole was the most celebrated man in Ilodu. The following morning, the king himself, in front of the full council, called Adisa forward and declared that he would be raised in rank, given land near the 7th hill, and that his son, Femi, would be personally sponsored into the palace guard training when he came of age. Bisi wept with pride. Femi could not stop grinning. For 7 days, Ilodun sang Adisa's name in the market, in the compounds, in the songs children made up while playing near the river. Those 7 days were, by every account Bisi ever gave afterward, the happiest of their entire marriage. Market women who had never once addressed Bisi by name suddenly called her Iya Adisa, with genuine warmth in their voices, pressed extra yams into her basket without charge, asked after Femi as though he were already a hero's son destined for greatness. Femi himself walked through the compound those days with his chest puffed out so far that Adisa teased him about tripping over his own pride. And in the evenings, father and son would sit outside their small home while Adisa, uncharacteristically talkative in those 7 golden days, described for Femi exactly how he had felt the wrongness in the crowd, exactly how his body had moved before his mind had finished deciding, exactly how a lifetime of watching rooms had finally paid for itself in the one moment it mattered most. "Will I ever be that fast, Papa?" asked Femi one of those nights, and Adisa had laughed, pulled his son close, and told him that speed was not the gift, watching was, that any man could learn to move quickly, but only a patient man could learn to see trouble before it announced itself. It was, BC would later say, the last truly light conversation she ever heard pass between her husband and her son, the last week before the weight of the world found its way back into Adisa's shoulders and never fully lifted again. Even Oba Ogundipe, in those 7 days, seemed lighter than BC had ever seen him at any festival gatherings over the years. He visited Adisa's compound personally on the 4th day, an almost unheard of gesture for a king towards a guard's household, and sat with them for the better part of an afternoon, Simisola trailing behind to play with Femi in the dust outside, while the 2 old friends talked quietly of nothing important, simply grateful, in the plain, unguarded way old friends allow themselves to be grateful that the worst had not happened. If this story ended there, it would be a good story. But it is not the story. It is only the hook. Because the assassin captured that night died in his cell before he could be questioned properly. Poisoned, the palace healer said, though how poison reached a heavily guarded prisoner remained officially unexplained. And 3 days after that, a rumor began to move through the palace corridors, slow and deliberate as smoke finding the gaps under a door. That Adisa himself had known the assassin, that Adisa's blade, not the assassin's blade, had made the fatal first cut that killed a palace guard during the chaos of the struggle, a guard who, conveniently, could no longer speak for himself. That Adisa's sudden movement towards the king, so fast, so precise, had not been the reflex of a loyal protector, but the choreography of a man covering his own tracks after his co-conspirator failed. I know what you are thinking. It sounds absurd. The man who threw himself in front of a blade for his king, accused of orchestrating the very attack he stopped. But you have to understand how rumors work inside a palace. They do not need to be believable. They only need to be repeated by the right mouth at the right moment to the right ear. And the mouth doing the repeating, gently, sorrowfully, as though she hated to even say such things, but someone must speak the truth for the sake of the kingdom's safety, was Yewande. Here is the twist you did not see coming, and it is the reason I told you at the very beginning not to trust how this story appears to be going. Yewande's assassin had failed. Her plot, months in the planning, had collapsed in front of 1,000 witnesses because one loyal guard moved half a second faster than her hired killer. She had lost her weapon. She had lost her window. A festival was over. The palace was on high alert, and Kayode was hiding in the hills, furious, demanding to know what had gone wrong.
But Yewande did not panic. She adapted. Because if she could not kill the king that night, she could still destroy the one man standing closest to him, the one man whose instinct had already proven sharp enough to eventually notice her. Adisa was no longer just an obstacle to a single assassination attempt. He was a permanent threat to every future attempt she might need to make. So she turned his heroism into his death sentence, using the oldest weapon available to a woman who had spent 24 years learning how palaces truly worked. Whispered doubt, delivered with a trembling voice and downcast eyes, dressed up as reluctant duty. If you are new to this channel, this is exactly the kind of story we tell here. Not simple heroes and simple villains, but the quiet, patient cruelty of people who smile while they plan your funeral. Subscribe now, because the next part of this story is where everything Adisa built his entire life around gets used against him. The council was called. Chief Adewosi, who genuinely did not know his wife's role in any of it, a detail worth remembering because Adewosi is not a villain in this story, only a man too trusting of the woman beside him, presided reluctantly over the questioning, uncomfortable but bound by his position to follow procedure.
Witnesses were summoned. The junior guard who had let Rotimi's cloth bundle pass weeks earlier was pressured, gently, by whispers he could not trace back to any single source, into remembering that Adisa had seemed unusually secretive in the days before the festival, unusually insistent on personally handling security details that should have been shared duties. None of it was false exactly. Adisa had been secretive. He had insisted on personal control. But the reason, his suspicion of Yewande herself, was never once mentioned, because the only person Adisa had told was the king, and the king, still grieving the death of his own certainty, said nothing in that first council session, waiting the way kings often wait to see which way the wind of popular opinion would blow before committing his voice to it. Adisa stood before the council with the same steadiness he had carried into every threat of his life. He explained the clay figure, he explained Rotimi, he explained the months of quiet watching. But Rotimi, when summoned, denied ever carrying anything but a blessing charm and swore, under what pressure we will never know for certain, though I have my suspicions and so will you by the end of this story, that Adisa had approached him privately weeks earlier, asking strange questions about the chief's household movements, questions Rotimi now framed as suspicious rather than protective. Do you see what was happening? Every true thing Adisa had done to protect his king was being folded, gently, patiently, into a story about a man planning betrayal. And the woman orchestrating that folding sat in the corner of the council chamber that day, her face arranged into an expression of pained sorrow, occasionally dabbing her eyes with the edge of her wrapper, saying almost nothing directly, letting others carry the weight of accusations she herself had planted weeks before anyone thought to look for a garden. The council chamber during those days had the particular heaviness of a room full of men who all privately doubted the story they were being asked to believe, but who lacked the courage individually to be the first voice to say it out loud. Chief Adewosi, presiding with visible discomfort, kept glancing toward his wife seated quietly at the edge of the chamber, drawing what he believed was strength from her presence, never once suspecting that the strength she offered him came from a woman calmly watching her own plan succeed beyond what she had even dared to plan for. One elder, a stooped ancient man named Baba Ilesami, who had served on the council before Oba Ogundipe was born, rose on the second day of questioning and asked the question no one else had dared ask aloud. He said, his voice trembling with age but not with doubt, "This guard threw himself between a blade and our king. Explain to me plainly why a man who wished the king dead would stop the blade meant to kill him. I have sat on this council for 40 years, and I have never once heard a conspirator argued to have foiled his own conspiracy." A murmur moved through the chamber, and for one brief moment, Adisa allowed himself to believe the tide might turn. But Yewande, when called upon to respond, gently, reluctantly, as though it pained her deeply to say such things about a man she had always respected, suggested with downcast eyes that perhaps the assassin never had been meant to succeed at all, that perhaps the entire attack had been staged from the beginning, a display of heroism manufactured to secure Adisa greater trust, greater access, greater room to maneuver before a second real attempt later in the season. It was a monstrous theory, built from nothing but implication, but it was delivered so softly, so sorrowfully, that several council members found themselves nodding before they had even finished considering whether it made any sense at all. Baba Elesami sat back down, unconvinced but outnumbered, and the momentum Adisa had briefly felt drained back out of the room like water through cracked clay. Bisi came to the council on the third day of questioning, Femi's small hand gripped tight in hers, and begged to speak. She was allowed exactly 3 sentences before being asked to sit. "My husband bled for this king. My husband has never once, not in 11 years, put his own safety above his duty. Ask yourselves who benefits from his silence being mistaken for guilt." Nobody answered her. Nobody wanted to.
Femi, too young to fully understand the proceedings, but old enough to understand that his father was in danger, tugged at her wrapper as they were led out and asked her in a whisper loud enough for several nearby guards to hear, "Why is everyone pretending not to know Papa didn't do this?" Bisi had no answer for him that day. It would be months before an answer finally arrived, and by then it would come too late to matter for the reason he most needed it to. Now, here comes the midpoint of this story, the place where everything changes. So stay with me, because this is the part people message me about months after watching. On the 5th night after the festival, unable to sleep, Adisa did something he had never done in 11 years of service. He searched the chief's private quarters without permission, without the king's knowledge, driven by the same instinct that saved his king's life days earlier. He was not looking for evidence of a crime he could name yet. He was looking simply for the shape of the wrongness he had always sensed and never proven. What he found in a locked chest beneath Yewande's private altar was a second clay figure, identical to the first, unused. A folded letter in handwriting he did not recognize, unsigned, referring to the regent's promise and when the old lion finally falls. And a small ceremonial dagger, ornately carved, that Adisa recognized instantly because he had personally inspected every weapon in the palace armory as part of festival security. This dagger had never come from the armory. It matched in craftsmanship and design a set gifted to Prince Kayode by a northern trading delegation nearly a decade earlier, before his banishment. Adisa stood in that dark room holding proof of a conspiracy that reached farther than he had ever imagined, not simply Yewande's ambition, but Kayode's exile-fueled hunger for the throne, threaded together through years of careful, patient planning that had very nearly ended his king's life a week earlier. The search itself had taken longer than Adisa expected. Yewande's private quarters were not simply a bedroom, but a small compound of rooms. A sitting room where she received visitors, a room for her wrappers and jewelry, and at the very back, behind a curtain of woven raffia, the small altar room where she kept the objects of her private devotions. The room Adisa had never once had reason to enter in 11 years of palace service. He had moved through the outer rooms quickly, quietly, aware of every creak in the floorboards, every distant cough from a sleeping servant in the next compound over. The chest beneath the altar was locked, but the lock was old, the kind used more to signal privacy than to actually prevent entry. And Adisa's hands, though trained for blades rather than thievery, had watched enough palace locksmiths over the years to manage it without much difficulty. When the lid finally gave way, his heart had been pounding not with fear of being caught, but with the dread of what he already suspected he would find. And there it was, laid out with the same careful, deliberate order Yewande brought to everything in her life, as though even her secrets required tidiness. He remembers, even now, the cold weight of the dagger in his palm, the strange formality of the unsigned letter's handwriting, elegant and unhurried, written by someone who had never once feared being caught. He remembers thinking, standing there in the dark, with proof of a conspiracy large enough to topple the throne itself resting in his hands, that he finally understood the shape of the wrongness he had sensed in Yewande for months. It was not madness, it was patience. And patience, he understood too late, is far more dangerous than madness could ever be, because madness makes mistakes, and patience simply waits for you to make yours. He should have taken it straight to Oba Ogundipe that same hour. This is the part of the story that still keeps me awake some nights, wondering how differently it might have gone if he had. But Adisa, ever cautious, ever the man who watched twice before speaking once, decided he needed one more piece, the identity of the handwriting on that unsigned letter, before bringing something this explosive to a king already wounded by doubt about his most loyal guard. He hid the items in a place he trusted, told no one, not even Bisi, and planned to return the following night to compare the handwriting against Kayode's known correspondence, kept in the palace archive from before the banishment. He never got the chance, because Yewande, checking her hidden chest that same night out of nothing more than habitual paranoia, found it disturbed. And she understood with the cold clarity of a woman who had spent her whole life reading rooms for danger exactly who had been inside her quarters and exactly what he must now know. If you have made it this far, you already understand this story is not going to give you an easy rescue. That is not what this channel does. But stay, because what happens in the final act is the reason people tell me this story haunts them for days. Yewande did not confront Adisa. She did not need to. Instead, she spent that entire night working, calm and methodical, even in crisis, the way a woman who has spent her whole life rehearsing for disaster finally puts 24 years of preparation to use. She sent for Rotimi before the moon had fully crossed the sky, and when he arrived, sleepy and confused, she did not shout at him, did not threaten him outright. She never needed to be that crude. She simply reminded him, softly, of his grandmother's death, of his own children currently sleeping soundly in a compound that depended entirely on wages her household provided, and told him that a guard, a stranger to their family really, when you thought about it, a man who had never once done anything for Rotimi's own children the way her family had quietly done for his for 3 generations, was about to accuse her of something monstrous, something that could see her hanged and her husband disgraced, and, by extension, see every family whose survival depended on the Balogun's household thrown into uncertainty overnight. "I am not asking you to lie," she told him. And perhaps she even believed this by then, having told so many careful half-truths for so many years that the line separating them from outright lies had long since blurred beyond her own recognition. "I am only asking you to remember accurately. Was Adisa not asking you strange questions these past weeks? Did he not seem unusually interested in matters that were not his concern? And because fear has a way of reshaping memory to fit whatever shape will make the fear stop, Rotimi found by the time the sun rose that he could indeed remember it exactly the way she described it, that he could not entirely recall anymore which parts were true and which parts were simply offered to him as a kinder alternative to the truth he actually remembered. She went to the council that very next morning with fresh evidence of her own, evidence she had spent that entire sleepless night constructing with the terrified, coerced help of Rotimi, whose own family's safety had quietly, wordlessly become the price of his continued cooperation. A blood-stained cloth, planted in Adisa's own quarters while he slept the exhausted sleep of a man who had spent 5 nights barely resting, matched, she claimed, with tears she had practiced enough times by now to summon on command, to the murdered palace guard's fatal wound. A second witness, a market trader with debts to the chief's household that made his testimony as reliable as a puppet's, swore that he had seen Adisa in secret conversation with a stranger matching the dead assassin's description 2 weeks before the festival. It was enough. Not because it was true, because it was more convenient than the truth, and convenience in a frightened palace travels faster than proof ever can. Adisa was arrested at dawn. 6 guards arriving at a compound gate that had never once needed more than a single visitor to announce itself. Men he had trained himself. Men who could not meet his eyes as they bound his wrists with rope instead of the ceremonial cloth reserved for guards of his rank. A small cruelty that told him more clearly than any spoken accusation exactly how far his standing had already fallen overnight. He did not resist. He had spent 11 years teaching young recruits that a guard's strength exists to protect the palace's order, never to defy it. And even now, wrongly accused, dragged from the only home his family had ever known, that lesson held. He was dragged from his home in front of Bisi and Femi, who screamed his name until his voice broke into silence somewhere past the compound gate. In the 7 days that followed, Oba Ogundipe barely slept. Guards posted near his private chambers later admitted, long after everything was finally resolved, that they had heard him pacing through most nights, sometimes muttering fragments of arguments he might have made differently before the council, sometimes simply silent for hours at a stretch. Queen Aduke, watching her husband unravel in private while maintaining perfect composure in every public appearance, begged him more than once to simply pardon Adisa outright, king's authority be damned. But Ogundipe refused, not out of any lack of love for his oldest friend, but out of a terror, deep and specific, that a king seen to overturn his own council's judgment on nothing but personal feeling would teach every future council that verdicts meant nothing whenever a king's affection intervened, an instability that could unravel Ilodun's entire system of justice for generations after his own reign had ended. It was, he would later admit to no one but Bisi, the single greatest failure of his life, choosing the abstract stability of a kingdom on the concrete life of the one man who had spent 11 years choosing him every single day without ever once asking for anything in return.
Young Semisola, only 7 at the time, did not understand why Adisa no longer visited, why her father had grown so quiet and distant during meals, why the guard who used to let her hide behind his legs during the loud festival drums had simply vanished from her life without explanation. She would not learn the full truth of what happened to him until she was much older, and when she finally did, she reportedly wept for an entire afternoon locked in her chambers, mourning a man whose absence she had felt for years without ever understanding its shape. He was given one final audience with the king before sentencing, and it is that conversation, more than any other moment in this entire story, that I think about most. "I found something," Adisa told him, hands bound, voice steady despite everything. "In her quarters, a dagger that belongs to Kayode, a letter about a regent's promise. I was going to bring it to you last night, but I wanted to be certain first." Oba Ogundipe searched his oldest friend's face for a long, silent moment, and I believe, truly, that some part of him wanted to believe every word. But a king surrounded by a council already convinced, by a grieving guard's widow whose testimony had been quietly discredited, by a chief's wife whose tears had moved even the coldest elders in that chamber, cannot simply believe on instinct alone, not when the evidence in front of him, however manufactured, sits stacked neatly, and the evidence behind him exists only as a story with no proof left to show for it. Because when guards were sent, at Adisa's own desperate direction, to retrieve the hidden items from where he had stashed them the night before, the chest was empty. Yewande, moving faster than grief allows most people to move, had already removed and destroyed everything. "Bring me the dagger," the king said quietly. "Bring me the letter. Bring me anything, Adisa, and I will tear this council apart with my own hands to save you." "They are gone," Adisa said. "She knew I found them. She was faster than me." There was nothing else to say after that. A king cannot rule on the word of a man against a council united in doubt, not without proof, not without something solid enough to survive challenge. Oba Ogundipe wept that night, alone, in a way none of his guards had ever witnessed before or since, according to the ones who stood outside his chamber door. But in the morning, hollow-eyed, he confirmed the council's sentence, because a king who breaks his own laws to save even his dearest friend is a king who has already lost the throne he sits on. The 7 days between sentencing and execution passed the way Bisi later described as feeling both endless and instant at once, each hour stretched thin with dread, yet somehow gone before she had prepared herself for the next one. She was allowed one final visit to Adisa's cell. Femi refused entry by guards who even then seemed uncomfortable enforcing an order none of them fully believed in. Adisa held his wife's hand through the wooden bars and told her calmly, the way he told her everything, that she must not let Femi grow up believing loyalty was foolish just because it had cost his father everything. "Tell him the truth caught up," he said, "even if it caught up too late for me. Tell him it still matters that it caught up at all." Bisi did not believe in that moment that the truth ever would. She simply nodded, because there was nothing else left to give him but agreement, and because some promises are made not because you believe them, but because the person asking needs more than anything else in the world to hear them said aloud one final time. Adisa Bankole was executed 7 days after he saved the life of the king he had guarded since childhood,
in the same courtyard where the festival drums had once celebrated his name. The crowd that gathered that morning was smaller than the one that had cheered him a season earlier, thinned by the quiet shame of a kingdom that was not entirely certain, even as it carried out the sentence, that it was watching justice rather than tragedy. Bisi was not permitted to watch. Femi, 9 years old, broke free from the neighbor holding him back and ran to the courtyard gate anyway, arriving just as the crowd began to disperse, just in time to see his father's body being carried away. And no child should ever have to carry a memory like that. But Femi did, for the rest of his life. Oba Ogundipe, watching from the palace balcony above, did not move for the entire duration of the execution, and it is said that his hand, gripping the balcony rail, did not fully release its hold until long after the courtyard had emptied and the last drum had gone silent. I need you to sit with that for a moment, because I promised you this story does not do comfortable endings, and I meant it. But I also promised you the story wasn't finished, and it isn't. This is the part where the truth, slow and patient the way truth so often is, finally catches up to the people who thought they had outrun it. If you've stayed this long, you deserve to see how it ends. So let's finish this together. 3 months after Adisa's execution, Prince Kayode, growing impatient with Yewande's excuses about why the regency still had not materialized, why Chief Adewosu remained inconveniently healthy, why the throne remained stubbornly out of reach, made a mistake born of pure arrogance. He sent Yewande a letter, written in the same hand as the one Adisa had found and lost, because Kayode, like many powerful men who have never truly been caught for anything, had grown careless with time. This letter was intercepted, not by a guard, not by a spy, but by 9-year-old Femi, who had taken to wandering the market roads near the 7th hill in the aimless, grief-heavy way that children sometimes do after losing a parent, and who recognized with the sharp, unclouded eyes of a child who had spent his whole short life listening to his father describe every detail of the case against him, the seal pressed into the letter's wax, a seal matching a description Adisa had once, in his final week alive, whispered to Bisi in the dark, the seal of the Northern Trading Delegation, the same seal that had marked the dagger he had found and lost. Femi did not fully understand what he was carrying, but he understood enough to bring it, trembling, to his mother, and Bisi understood enough to bring it, at enormous personal risk, straight to the palace healer, the same healer who had quietly, privately always doubted the official story of the assassin's convenient death in his cell, and who had, in the months since Adisa's execution, been discreetly gathering his own observations, unable to prove anything alone, waiting, as careful people sometimes must, for one true piece to finally surface. The healer, a soft-spoken man named Odosonya, who had tended 3 generations of the royal family and had known Adisa since the guard was a boy training in the courtyard below his window, had never believed the poison that killed the captured assassin arrived by accident. He had examined the body himself, quietly, before it was hastily buried by the council's orders, and had noted a residue on the dead man's lips that matched no medicine kept anywhere in the palace stores, a residue he had in fact seen once earlier, years earlier, applied to ceremonial wine cups during a diplomatic visit from the very Northern Trading Delegation, whose seal now sat pressed into wax on the letter trembling in Bisi's hands. He had said nothing at the time, because a healer's suspicion, like a guard's, is worth nothing without proof, and he had learnt, watching Adisa's trial unfold and end in tragedy, how little the palace valued suspicion without proof. But he had kept his observations, written in his own private notes, waiting, as careful people sometimes must. When Bisi placed the letter in his hands, Odusonya did not hesitate. He took it directly to the king himself, bypassing the council entirely, because he understood, as Adisa once had, that some truths need to reach a king before they can be twisted by a room full of frightened men into something more convenient to believe. When Odusonya placed the letter in the king's hands, Oba Ogundipe went completely still for a long moment, the way a man goes still when a wound he has spent months learning to live around is suddenly violently reopened.
He read the letter twice, then a third time, his hands trembling slightly by the final reading. And when he finally looked up at Odusanya, his eyes were wet in a way none of his private guards outside the door would ever describe to anyone else out of respect for him. "Bring the boy," he said quietly. "Bring Femi to me. I want to hear from his own mouth exactly where he found this." Femi was brought before the king for the first time since his father's execution, small and uncertain in the same throne room where Adisa had once stood accused. And when Oba Ogundipe knelt down to his level, an almost unthinkable gesture for a king toward a 9-year-old commoner, and asked him gently to describe exactly what he had seen and where, Femi's voice shook through the first few words before steadying, the same steady calm his father had once carried through every crisis of his own career. "I remembered the seal Kabayesi," Femi said, using the royal honorific with the same care his father had always taught him. "Papa told Mama about it once. I never forgot." The king held that boy's shoulders for a long moment afterward and said nothing at all, because there are some debts too large for words to properly carry, and he understood in that moment that he owed this child something no throne, no title, no posthumous honor could ever fully repay. The letter was brought before the full council. This time, there was no missing chest, no destroyed evidence, no council convinced of a convenient story. There was a widow, a grieving child, a suspicious healer, and a physical letter in a hand that palace scribes confirmed, after careful comparison against Kayode's old correspondence, matched the exiled prince's own writing. What followed was swift and it was thorough, in the way a king's fury becomes thorough once it finally has somewhere honest to land. Oba Ogundipe himself led the party of guards sent north, refusing to remain behind in the palace while the men responsible for his oldest friend's death remained free to breathe the same air as their victims. Kayode was captured within the month, attempting to flee north, toward the very trading delegation whose gifted dagger had first tied him to the plot. Holed up in a caravan way station 2 days' ride from Ilodun's border, betrayed in the end, fittingly, by the same northern traders who had once armed his ambition and who now, faced with the choice between an exiled prince's dwindling coin and a reigning king's undying gratitude, chose gratitude without a moment's hesitation. He did not survive his capture, the details of which the palace never fully released, though the market has always had its own theories, and I will let you form your own about what a king does to the man who stole a king's peace and stole his brother's oldest friend from him. Yewande's unraveling was slower, and in some ways crueler, because a king's fury once earned honestly does not always need to be fast to be complete. She was brought before the very council she had once manipulated so effortlessly, seated this time not at the chamber's comfortable edge, but in the center, where accused men and women were made to stand. She wore no tears that day. Perhaps she understood finally that tears had already spent all the currency they were ever going to earn her. Rotimi, freed finally from whatever threat had held his tongue for months, once guards were dispatched to quietly ensure his family's safety before he was asked to speak, told the full truth. Every detail, from the clay figures to the coerced testimony to the blood-stained cloth planted in a sleeping innocent man's quarters, his voice breaking twice as he described the months of quiet terror he had lived under, terror he had never once had the courage to name until someone finally made it safe to do so. Baba Ile Somi, the old elder who had once asked the one honest question the entire First Council had been too frightened to sit with, rose again during Yewande's trial, and this time no one interrupted him. "I asked once why a conspirator would foil his own conspiracy," he said, looking directly at Yewande for the first time since the proceedings began. No one answered me then. I did not need an answer.
I only needed the rest of you to sit with the silence long enough to hear how loud it was." Yewande said nothing in response. She had by then run out of stories. Chief Adeusi, learning for the first time the full depth of his wife's 24 years of careful, patient calculation, said nothing throughout the entire proceeding and aged visibly in the space of a single afternoon, a man discovering all at once that the person he had trusted longest had been a stranger the entire time. He resigned his position as Balogun the following week, not because the king demanded it, but because he told the council quietly that a man who could not see the danger sleeping beside him for 24 years had no business advising a kingdom on how to recognize danger anywhere else. Yewande was not executed in the courtyard where Adisa had died. The king, in the one mercy this story offers, refused to let her death share that ground with his friend's memory. She was instead sent from Ilodo entirely, stripped of her title, her name forbidden from being spoken within the palace walls, exiled to a distant compound where, according to the few travelers who ever passed near it, she lived out her remaining years alone, tending a small garden, visited by no one, her ambition finally, permanently, immovably out of reach. Some travelers claim she spent her final years speaking to no one at all, her once famous smile never once seen again by anyone who passed that compound's gate. Others claimed she wrote letters, dozens of them, addressed to a husband who never once opened them and to a son she never had, and that those letters were burned unread one by the few servants assigned to her isolated household, until nothing of her old ambitions remained anywhere except in the memory of the kingdom she had tried and failed to steal. And Adisa, this is the part I need you to hear clearly, because it is the whole reason this story is worth telling at all. Adisa was given, posthumously, the highest honor Ilodun could offer a god, his name carved on the stone at the base of the 7th hill, alongside the kings and war heroes of generations past, the first commoner's name to ever sit among them. Oba Ogundipe personally walked to Adisa's compound, knelt before Bisi in front of the entire palace household and asked her forgiveness, which she gave him, not because it erased anything, but because she understood in her own grief that carrying hatred alongside sorrow leaves no room in a heart for a 9-year-old boy who still needed his mother whole. Femi did grow up to join the palace guard, exactly as his father had once dreamed, sponsored personally, just as the king had promised on that celebrated morning so many years earlier, though the promise now arrived heavier than either of them could have imagined it would. His early training was not easy. The other young recruits, some of them sons of the very council members who had sat silent through his father's trial, did not always know how to look him in the eye, and Femi carried a quiet, controlled anger that his training captain, an old friend of Adisa's from his own recruit days, understood better than anyone and never once tried to rush out of him. "Your father learned to watch before he learned to move," the captain told him during his hardest year of training, when Femi's anger had nearly gotten him dismissed twice. "Slow down, or you will become exactly the kind of guard who gets someone he loves killed through carelessness, and I do not believe that is the inheritance you want to carry." Femi slowed down. He served Elodum for the rest of his life, eventually rising in his own turn to captain of the palace guard, training the next generation the same patient way his father had once been trained, always careful to tell every new recruit the full story of Adisa Bankole, not the shortened, comfortable version the market songs preferred, but the whole difficult truth of it, that loyalty is not always rewarded quickly, that patience is not always vindicated in time, that doing the right thing sometimes costs you everything before it costs your enemies anything at all, and that you do it anyway, because the alternative is a kingdom where no one stands between a blade and the people they've sworn to protect. Bisi lived to see her son take that captaincy, lived long enough to watch Queen Aduke's own grown daughter, Similola, still remembering the guard whose legs she used to hide behind during festival drums, personally ensure that Bisi never wanted anything in her later years. And it is said, though I cannot promise you this last detail is anything more than the kind of story a kingdom terms itself to survive its own grief, that on quiet nights, standing guard exactly where his father once stood, 2 steps behind the throne, Femi would sometimes speak softly into the dark, telling his father everything the kingdom had become in his absence, as though loyalty, once given fully enough, never truly ends when the body carrying it does. That is the story of Adisa Bankole, the guard who saved the king's life and was executed for it, and the woman whose smile hid 24 years of patient calculation until a 9-year-old boy's grief-heavy wandering finally brought her down. If this story moved you, if it made you angry, if it made you sit in silence after it ended, that is exactly what we try to do on this channel every single week. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and join the thousands of people who come here, not for stories that make them feel comfortable, but for stories that make them feel something real. I'll see you in the next one.